Reactive training systems.
Hey guys, welcome back to the RTS podcast. I'm going to make this intro short and sweet. I've got a great discussion with Jacob Tsypkin tonight, and we talk about a lot of different things, mostly centered around coaching skills and some of my ideas on technical coaching and things like that. But I think it's going to be really interesting. If you're not familiar with Jacob, he's been on the podcast a few times before. Always have a really great conversation with him, and his background is coaching competitive CrossFit athletes all the way up to games level competitors, and just a really smart guy. He at one point, just by way of giving you a little bit of additional background, but at one point he kind of had this idea that, like, how can I provide some sort of justified belief in the things that I believe about training. And that line of questioning took him down this, as you'll see, this deep exploration of philosophy. And it's given him a really great skill set through which to view training and to view all these types of things that we tend to care about. So again, I said I'd make this intro short, so I'm going to cut it off there and just bring you right into the discussion that I had with Jacob Tsypkin. Yeah, the delusions of grandeur in the weight room don't help.
Every strength athlete's like their fantasies are all delusions of grandeur, because the best thing you're going to do is be the world's best powerlifter, and nobody cares.
Right, yeah. Yeah. Well, it's funny. So this is a random thought that came up during my conversation with Dave Tate a couple weeks ago. I don't know if you got a chance to listen to that.
I listened to a few snippets. I haven't listened front to back. Sounded like a good one, though.
It was awesome. Like, I really enjoyed it. One of the things that, just an idea, and I don't remember the exact context of how it came up, but this idea kind of popped up that, as an athlete, really to get at your potential in some way, whatever that is,
mm-hmm.
You kind of have to entertain some delusions of grandeur. You've got to
100%.
Yeah, and just kind of believe some things and be willing to push things too far.
Yeah, you have to be unrealistic. Being a high level athlete is not it's not a realistic goal.
Yeah.
Or rather, I mean, like, obviously it's realistic in some sense, but more what I'm trying to express is that, like, you have to have some unreasoned faith in yourself. Because if you try to reason yourself into it, what you're going to find is it's a dumb bad idea, because there's, depending on the sport, hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of other people trying to do the same thing. And the odds are that through some combination of genetics, training, and luck, they're, it's not you against each other individual. It's you against this, like, conglomerated mass of other people trying to do the same thing. The odds are not in your favor. And if you start to think about it, it's a bad idea. Don't think about it.
Well, so then take it a step further, right? And say that you as a coach, you're experienced, you're supposed to have perspective, and you're supposed to be providing guidance to people
mm-hmm.
who are going through this process, right?
Yeah.
So at the same time, you have a goal. They have this athletic aspiration, so a lot of times coaches talk about finding themselves in positions where they have to hold athletes back a little bit, make sure that an athlete's not doing anything too stupid that causes them to have a career that's too short. But at the same time, what if that willingness to push things a little bit too far is part of what creates the edge?
I think it is. I think successful athletes are natural risk takers. So I don't think the goal is to eliminate that tendency. It's merely to mitigate it. It's exactly what you said. It's to keep them from doing anything too stupid. You have to acknowledge they're gonna, like, by nature, the kind of people who generally tend to become really successful athletes. I don't even mean to say, like, I don't want to say they do things that are stupid, because I'm not even sure what I would mean by that. What I want to say is that, like, they will take things too far. in pursuit of a goal. And I don't think there's any way to fully stop them from doing that. And I think you're exactly right that if you did fully stop them, you'd probably kill that edge a little bit. So I think the role of the coach is just to mitigate that. It's just to provide some perspective and say, like, look, I'm going to give you reasons why doing X, Y, Z is a bad idea, expecting you to still do X, but maybe forego Y and Z. And I think as a coach, like, you just have to be okay with that and sort of understand that that's your role. And I also think this is something we've talked about. Athlete autonomy is so important. If you're serious about your athletes reaching the highest level of performance they can, you must be building them towards a sense of autonomy in their training. And building towards autonomy requires making mistakes. And you just have to, I think our job as coaches is to accept beforehand that those mistakes are going to happen, and try to, one, kind of avoid the most dangerous ones, and two, be prepared to assist with damage control with the ones that do happen.
Yeah. It's just a fine line to walk as well. You know, you're and it's something that's not clear either. It's not a thing where you could say, like, okay, we're going to sit down, I'm going to teach you how to do this, you know? Right. As a coach, you've got to, and we talk about this a lot, that some athletes need to be pushed, some athletes need to be held back, and all this thing. But really what that indicates is that there's this fine line that needs to be walked. And that's where, you know, optimal training, this unicorn of optimal training lives. And you're trying to get as close to that as possible, you know? So it's a fine line. Where's that fine line? Well, crap, that's hard to define.
Yeah, maybe impossible. I think probably defining the line is a misguided pursuit, right?
Sure.
The line is probably constantly moving. It's probably different for every athlete. It almost certainly moves over the course of an athlete's career. I think, like, you know, one thing worth mentioning here is that the mistakes that are critical to avoid are probably different for each athlete, depending on how well they deal with it, right? If you have an athlete with a really even temperament who is, like, relatively kind of, you know, they're on an even keel. They're not too high, not too low. They're driven and they're motivated, but they're also, like, pragmatic's not the word. They are, they're reasonable in the way they deal with things. Then it might be less critical to avoid certain mistakes for that athlete, because the mistake's going to happen, and you can be, you know, like, reasonably, you can have a reasonable faith that the athlete is going to deal with it well and it'll be a learning experience. Whereas some athletes who maybe tend to be a little bit more emotional, you know, more up and down, then avoiding the really big mistakes is that much more important, because you never know which one is the one that just drives them out of the sport.
Sure. Yeah. You know, that's there's a psychological tendency in here somewhere, and I don't know, man. It's like on the tip of my tongue. I think I need to come back to the idea, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot to be said for the fact that, like, high-level athletes, I think, are just, like I said, inclined towards risk-taking behavior. There might actually be research on that. I feel like I read some research on that years ago, but it's also just, it's something that you have probably noticed. It might vary sport to sport, right? Like, I would wager, like, obviously BMX racers are more prone to risk-taking behavior than powerlifters. But to some extent, like, just the process of competing is taking a risk. Even, like, foregoing the physical risk, you're taking an emotional risk. You're putting yourself on the line. You are taking this huge risk, which is that your best might not be good enough. That's a really big emotional risk, right? It's a really, really big risk to say, I'm going to give this everything I have, and I might fall short. I might fall really short. So I think, like, as a preliminary step to even being serious about competition, you have to be a bit of a natural risk taker. Like, I'm very risk averse naturally, at least certain types of risks. And, like, as a result, I've never really enjoyed competition. I don't like who I am when I compete, like, because I'm so averse to the risk that, like, my whole life centers around competition, and I just kind of become an acerbic prick, even more so one than usual, which is saying something.
Well,
dealing with that, being able to deal with those risks well is another big part of, I think, of being a successful athlete.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, and speaking of risk, I think there's an interesting bias here when you look at lessons learned, and really the hindsight bias plays kind of in a weird way here, because you can take somebody who's experienced in the sport and they, you know, impart these lessons learned, and it always tends to be risks that they wish that they had avoided, you know, because risks that you avoided that you should have taken that would have paid off are not available to you cognitively. You know?
You're right. Yeah. How, like, what does that look like? I mean, certainly there are some really obvious cases, right? Where like, yeah, somebody offered you some great, I don't know, contract or some great opportunity, and you said no because you didn't want to leave your hometown or some shit. But like, how many times does that happen? That's not the real world. That's
it's more like, you know, and of course I focus on training so much, so I'm thinking of training examples, but it's like, you know, if you would have tried this, that would have worked and resulted in some massive improvement, but you never tried it, so you never know.
I mean, you can even extrapolate it over time, like using the RPE scale. We've talked before about how the most important part of the scale, you know, within a certain range, is that precision is more important than accuracy, right? It doesn't matter so much if your at-9 is actually 1 rep in the tank. Maybe it's like 1 rep, or I could add 20 pounds for some people, or maybe for some people, when they do an at-9, they're actually doing an at-8. If they do that all the time, if it's consistent, then that's the most important thing. However, like here's an example of a risk that's not cognitively available to most people. What if you had taken the risk of pushing your at-9s harder, learned that skill, and then from then on, over the next 5 years of training, all of your at-9s were a few percentage points heavier? How much stronger could you be after half a decade of that? I don't know, but the issue is exactly what you're saying. There's not really a way for me to look back. Like, I legitimately believe every at-9 I've ever done was a legit at-9, except for the ones where I was like, oops, didn't quite hit that number here. But for the most part, like, you just assume that it's correct and that you're doing the right thing. It's more or less impossible to reflect on it and say, you know, over the course of those 5 years or whatever, all my at-9s were really at-8s. But it could have, exactly like you're saying, a huge impact. Huge.
Yeah. And I mean, to some extent, there's things that you don't know and can't do anything about. But I think where this bias kind of plays out, since you do tend to reflect on the risks that you ought not to have taken, the coach, who tends to be the experienced one in this relationship, has all those things available to them and has all these risks that they wish that they had avoided, or things that they wish they had avoided in other athletes and things like that.
Right.
So maybe that tends to drive the line toward being a bit more conservative in decision making than is ideal, you know?
Yeah. Well, and like we were saying before, I think the real skill for a coach is to understand which athletes should be encouraged to take risks and which athletes should be encouraged to avoid them. If you have an athlete who is just like gung-ho 100% all the time, you know, that's going to tend to be the kind of athlete who you need to rein in a little bit. Whereas if you have an athlete who just by nature is like, and you often, at least in my experience, I often get this with athletes who maybe started a little bit later in life, who maybe don't have, like, you know, if you have an athlete who started playing sports when they were 5, maybe like wrestled and played Pop Warner football and all this and that. They played sports all through high school and college, and then they get into powerlifting or CrossFit. You don't really have to convince that person to take risks. They're naturals at it, and if anything, you might have to hold them back a little bit. But when you have an athlete who like didn't really play sports in college and high school, you know, maybe they're just in generally good shape, or maybe they played sports casually. Then taking risks is kind of a learned skill. I have a really good friend, longtime friend, one of the most athletic people I know. I remember this guy when we were like in high school, middle school, we'd like go to parks, and I don't know if you've ever seen those, like, we called it a Spider-Man structure. It's like structures. Yeah. I remember him as a fairly big guy, like 15 years old, he's probably 6 feet tall, and not big, like 160 pounds, not a small human being. He would take, like, put one leg and one arm to his side, and he would climb it with one leg and one arm upside down. That kind of stuff. Just like you teach him a movement, and he's just like, bam, I know how to do this instantaneously. But almost all of his sporting experience, apart from some swimming competition, has been super casual. It comes from a really active family where they do all kinds of like running and biking, but like just not really. He never really competed in any really meaningful sense. Even when he did compete, like he went to the CrossFit Games on a team, but he's just never had that like oomph, that drive. And he's exactly the kind of athlete who could be massively successful. I mean, he could do any sport he wanted to, and he could be just an absolute animal, but he would need a coach who would push him to take risks. Whereas there's plenty of people I know who are much less gifted than this guy physically, but who make it further on their own just because it's in their nature or in their nurture or whatever to push those limits a little bit more. And yeah, being able to tell the difference, or rather not even tell the difference, to see where an athlete is on that spectrum is a crucial skill.
Yeah. I saw a post from Steve Magnus, who you kind of turned me on to his work.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, saw something from him that's sort of related to this, where he was talking about how, so for anybody that doesn't know, running coach, it's talking about how in a race there's a lot of things that are unexpected, but in a training setting, there's not. Everything is clearly defined. You know where you're going. You know how many sets and reps you're going to do, and everything is very clear and laid out. And that maybe there's some value in putting yourself into some positions that are where things happen in unexpected ways. Within reason. I can definitely see that from a powerlifting standpoint. That I know for myself, when I was competing, if I'm training at the same gym all the time, then going to a different gym, it takes me longer to kind of get focused in the same way. And it probably takes a couple sessions before things get rolling. Fatigue and things like that aside, just the act of going to a new environment, I can expect a little bit of a performance decrease, Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So at this point, if I was going to, take a competition very seriously, I think I would put myself in those types of positions intentionally to try to train some of that out.
Yeah. I mean, I think the key to understanding this is understanding that competition is a skill.
Yeah.
Competing is a skill. A great example of like the skill of competing is Chad Smith from Juggernaut. Chad is very good at the skill of competing. Like he consistently outperforms his best training numbers, obviously, or did when he was powerlifting. He's kind of like semi-retired now, but consistently would outperform his best lifts from the gym on the platform. Not everybody does that, and that's okay. Like, people compete differently, but the point here is that like Chad had honed that specific skill of being able to get into that competitive environment, have a lot of faith in his training. That's a really big part of the skill of competition, in my opinion, is having faith in the process, having faith that the work you have put in is going to pay off, and going out there and taking those risks and going big. And that's a skill that you can acquire and develop like any other skill, right? Of course, also like any other skill, there are like genetic or epigenetic aspects to it. Some people are just going to be naturally better at it than others for whatever reason. In the same way that Chad was born with wrists the size of my knees. He was born strong. But that doesn't negate the actual skill acquisition aspect. The time you put into getting good at competing, not just getting good at your sport, getting good at competing. It's a skill that can be built, and I think what you're talking about is exactly certainly one of the ways that it's built, by how do you get stronger? Well, you push the limits of your strength. You push the limits of your sort of your psyche, your ability to focus and be unflustered by taking risks. and that's how you get good at competing. If you don't do that, you're just never going to compete to the limits of your potential.
Yeah, yeah. You said something, it's been a few minutes ago now, but something I wanted to touch on a bit more that I suppose kind of reminded me of a thing that's been bouncing around in my head a lot lately. You were talking about athlete autonomy and how important that is. And that this seems unconnected, but I'll connect it in just a second.
Mm-hmm.
I've been having lots of conversations with lifters about not just about technique, but about the way that I go about coaching technique. So obviously I focus super hard on individualization and really hyper individualizing training programs.
Yeah.
That's kind of my thing. So one thing that came up is, as I'm thinking about this, and we talked about this a little bit, is how do you go about individualizing technique?
Mm-hmm.
So you have somebody, we know that different people are different. So if you have a detailed technical model in your mind that's very, very well articulated, and you're comparing an athlete's movement to this very detailed model, then you can provide detailed feedback to the athlete, but it's not individualized. But if you have just a more rough model,
you have general parameters,
right? Then you can individualize the feedback that you're giving them, but it's not detailed, because it's only a rough model that you're comparing to.
Yeah.
Now, I talked to I did a podcast with Megan Bryanton, who was really smart about this, and I think had a really great answer. And she was talking about comparing an athlete's technique to their own technique. So as the weight gets heavier, watching technical breakdowns and deviations. And so I thought, well, that's really smart. And then as I've kind of gone forward from there, I've been learning more about Franz Bosch, and I think we've talked about everything.
I remember when we talked about this. I don't remember the terms, but I remember you said that Bosch has basically a model for like determining which things in a given movement are sort of unassailable rules of the technique and which things are in need of individualization. I don't recall what he has terms for it, and you told me them, but I'm a dumb head and I don't remember them.
No, man, I think it's incredible that every topic that comes up is like, oh, we talked about this. So, well, Bosch's terminology, the critical factors would be attractors.
Yeah, that's right.
So these would be, if we're talking about the squat, for example, legal competition depth is going to be one thing. So things that are required are attractors. Things that often result in injury probably need an attractor there. So don't round your back in the squat and things like that. But there's still lots of room for fluctuation, and things like stance width are things that's a fluctuator that we would all agree on. Grip width and bar position, for the most part, we would all agree on that.
And whatever.
Yeah. So stuff like that. But I think there's others too. And really, when you get into mastering especially a simple movement like a squat, there's lots of things that are going on that the athlete can feel that would not be obvious to anybody, even if you were looking very closely.
Yeah.
So you want to get at those things too.
It's almost as though the athlete has an internal experience. What if that experience even matters? What a strange concept.
Well, so I'm going to try to draw all this stuff together, right? But so you want to be able to get at those things, that internal experience, because that's really the thing that you're trying to coach. You're trying to put the athlete in a position where they feel it. They feel what the correct movement feels like, because that's what they have to do when they're executing it. So you have these attractors, these non-negotiables, and I think those can be pretty explicitly coached. That you can coach those things verbally, and that's fine. But the rest of it, I think ideally you want to allow the athlete to self-organize and just kind of figure out what this feels like, so that's why I'm kind of in favor of not over coaching. If I see a problem, like the chest fall pattern that I always talk about with the squat, where the butt comes up but the barbell doesn't, that type of thing going on, instead of, and this is where, I think maybe my coaching technique is, there's some room for some disagreement here, but what I've done in the past is instead of telling them, just over cueing, in my mind, over cueing chest up, chest up, chest up, chest up all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I like to prescribe a movement that is going to reward them for doing it correctly and allow them to use more weight, because powerlifters want to do that, and punish them for doing it wrong. So the front squat is a great example of that. If you exhibit that chest fall pattern, you're going to bump the bar, so, and I mean, that's far from the only one, right? You can do pin squats and safety bar squats and you get similar types of effects. But the idea is that I'm going to put you in this position where if you mess it up, you're going to know it right away,
Yeah, I do similar things, in particular with the Olympic lifts. So great examples of the Olympic lifts are lifts like a no contact snatch, a snatch where the bar cannot touch your hip. It does exactly what you're describing, which is that it creates a feedback loop, right? Because the athlete knows immediately if they fucked up or not. You touched your hip, you did the lift wrong. And this kind of stuff, I think, is especially important for people in our position who are primarily, and maybe even exclusively, really working remotely, where it's a lot easier to do a good job of cueing an athlete through their technical errors when you're right there doing it in real time. That is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, advantages of being an on-site coach. So we have to have ways to work around that. And I think exactly what you're describing is the best way to work around it. Select exercises that are built to emphasize the qualities that you want to improve, whether it's using a front squat to improve posture, whether it's using like a no contact snatch to improve the line of pull. The point is that the athlete doesn't need you to be there to correct them. So long as they understand what they're supposed to be doing and understand the purpose, they don't even really have to understand the purpose of the exercise. So long as they have a way to know if they fucked up.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, and I think that's one area that I could probably improve on is doing a better job of communicating the intent of the drill. I think if you know that, then that maybe drives the message home a little bit more. Now, the risk that you run into there, and I'm just thinking my own coaching experiences, some people you're going to say, hey, I've got you doing safety bar squats. And it's so that we can kind of eliminate this chest fall pattern. So I want you to practice doing it correctly. So in their mind, this changes. Now we're doing technique work. It's not necessarily technique work. I still want you to load it up and go. You're a power lifter. Go as heavy as you can.
Or rather, maybe another way of putting that is the fact that it is technique work does not mean it shouldn't be heavy or hard.
Yes. Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. I run into this as well. One of the things that I think I do better than a lot of coaches is use written language. Like when I write out programs for my athletes, most of the time it's very detailed. There are notes on everything. They know, as long as they read the notes, which happens at least 30% of the time, they will have a clear idea of what they're supposed to be doing. But not all my athletes get those notes. And it's precisely because going back to this idea of like, look, programming is not that hard. Once you know the details, or once you know like the basic principles, the actual writing of a program, not that difficult. Even for something like CrossFit, what I do, right? Like the hard part is the coaching, the management of that program and the athlete implementing that program over the course of weeks and months and years. And again, this comes back to like, know the athlete you're working with. It's not just like some athletes need to be encouraged to take risks. Some athletes need to be told to stop taking risks. This is the same kind of thing. Some athletes are going to thrive when you sit down and explain everything you're doing to them. Not all athletes. Some athletes are going to be on that exact opposite of that spectrum, where if you do that, they're going to overthink. They're going to oh, it's technique work, it's light. They're not going to push themselves either because they don't understand, like for some reason in their heads, heavy weight and technique are disparate. They're different from each other, or simply because they get into a habit of overthinking and they lose focus. And it's crucial to know which athlete you're dealing with at any given time.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you there. And I think that connects back to what you were saying about autonomy in the beginning, because, well, I suppose maybe a nitpick is that you mentioned that that this type of, I don't even know what you would call it, this more subtle technical instruction, like coming up with drills that help to coach the technique. Sure. You mentioned that as being kind of a workaround for an online coach. I don't know that it's necessarily an inferior method of going about it,
That's all what I was implying. I was simply saying that it's an even more critical tool for people in our position.
Yeah.
Inferior. I think that it's something that should be employed, just period. But the nature of online coaching is that you
have to do it.
Right. We just have fewer tools at our disposal, so the ones that we do have become that much more critical.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that's how it kind of connects into the autonomy piece. If I can allow an athlete to, say you're a sumo deadlifter, I want you to select.
Also known as a dirty cheater.
I want you to be able to select, like, there's just this whole range between, feet slightly outside of your hands to feet all the way out to the plates,
Ed Cohn's sumo deadlift and what's the Russian guy's name? Belyaev?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're two different deadlifts.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that's an obvious one, right? Obviously that you've got to find the one that's the athlete's the strongest, and that's obvious. But there's all these little tiny ways that athletes self-organize to solve movement problems. And you have to allow them and even encourage them to figure that stuff out. And that's what it's like, somebody sends me a video of the squat, unless there's something just really egregious going on, unless they're really violating one of those attractors, then it's going to be like, yep, looks good. Now that may drive other training decisions that we make. And that's, in my mind, at least, that's fine, but yeah, they can figure it out as they go. And it's also kind of this misnomer, not a misnomer, but just a misconception that people have, that the technique that once you've perfected your technique, you're done, like, and I'll just continue to do this forever, No, as you go, it's going to change and evolve. And, one day you're going to go, man, my hip's bugging me a little bit. Well, hey, when I turn my feet more forward, it goes away. So I guess I'll do that for a while. And maybe you go back, maybe you don't. Maybe you find out, this is actually stronger now. And it changes and evolves over time. So there's got to be some skill component to that.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just the movement intelligence thing that you were talking about before as well.
Yeah, but I think it's like, so the thing you're describing, I completely agree with. Like, technique does change over time. There's any number of factors. What if you start powerlifting as a 81 kilo lifter? Is it 81 still in the IPF? 83?
83, yeah.
Let's say you start lifting weights when you're 17 years old. If you lift weights for the next decade, you're not going to be an 83 when you're 27, hopefully, right? You're going to be up a couple weight classes. Putting on that much mass can have significant implications for your technique. That's okay. That's normal. The most common example I work with is the Olympic lifts as strength goes up, especially for CrossFit athletes, because for CrossFit athletes, I'm of the opinion that raw strength is a more important quality than like Olympic lifting prowess, simply because if you have two athletes who snatch let's say 300 pounds, and one of them has a 500-pound deadlift and a 400-pound squat, and the other one has a 600-pound deadlift and a 500-pound squat, the one with the lower squat and deadlift is a better weightlifter, but his skill set is not as applicable to CrossFit, right? Because there's no weight classes. You don't care about being more efficient. You care about lifting more weight and having that surplus of strength for other events. But what we very, very often see is, let's say we come out of the season and an athlete needs to go through a really strength-focused cycle. We really want to get their legs stronger. You can have an athlete put 15 kilos on their squat, and all of a sudden their snatch looks like trash. Well, what happened? Their technique changed as a result of them being able to apply more force. The force curve changed. Even if the positions are the same, which they're often not, but even if they are, the timing is different. The way they're applying force to the bar, the amount of acceleration they can get on the bar changes, and that might necessitate either a period of rebuilding their technique. It might sometimes necessitate changes in technique. If an athlete has like a 1-to-1 squat to deadlift ratio, which you sometimes see with weightlifters, and then suddenly they put a bunch of weight on their deadlift, they're going to pull the bar differently. And I think the two mistakes are, number one, not understanding that this is just a natural part of the process. It's going to happen. You need to be ready for it. And the second mistake is that when it does happen, what oftentimes people try to do is sort of shoehorn the athlete back into the technique that used to be successful for them, rather than giving them the sort of exploratory freedom to figure out what works now.
Yeah, 100% on that. Yeah, for sure. And then also there's the kinds of technical things that we're talking about it's not like completely reworking everything from the ground up. It's going to be like these subtle things. And at least in the power lifts, they're going to be things that I think even a coach who's got a detailed eye and who's paying attention, you're going to have a hard time picking up on this stuff, especially just from a video. You've got to be able to, again, allow the athlete to have some autonomy to figure this stuff out. And they say, hey, it feels better when I, take an extra breath before I descend on the squat. Like, nobody's going to have a problem with that. If that feels better, then do it,
The key is, so number one, what I want to say is, like, this fits perfectly with Bosch's model, because yes, the attractors have to stay the same.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth noting that, like, the first step I think a coach can take in order to improve this aspect of their coaching is just acknowledging that there are attractors and fluctuators, right? I think what happens oftentimes is when people think about technique, they sort of think about all aspects of technique at once, as if they're all equally important, even though I think most coaches would tell you, like, on an intellectual sort of level, they would agree that obviously some things are more important than others, but the way they actually behave sort of puts everything laterally. And I think that the first step to not doing that is just fixing in your mind the idea that some things matter more than others. But yeah, going back to sort of what you were saying is that, like, the key here is understanding that the athlete has an internal experience of their training, and that experience matters. It sounds so silly, but like most people, listen, humans are terrible at understanding that other humans have the same vivid personal experience of the world that we do, right? There's actually, I remember reading, there is a term for it in some other language. There's a specific term for the sensation that overcomes you when you think deeply about the fact that every other person on the planet has exactly as vivid a personal experience as you do. We're not built to understand that. It's how do you even comprehend that? It doesn't make any sense.
It's a lot easier if you pretend everyone else is a robot.
I for other reasons. It's just fun. But yeah, but once you understand that, once you stick that in your head and sort of let that be the basis of the way that you interact with athletes, it becomes a lot easier to step back and say, sort of differentiate between the things that you actually know and the things that you're merely speculating on. And those things you collaborate with the athlete on.
Hold on. Sorry, I have to jump in here, because I think this is the language that allows me to articulate a certain problem that I've got. It's commonplace, and even people who I very deeply respect in the coaching world like to talk about how the skills that you need to be a great coach and the skills that you need to be a great athlete are different. And I would agree with that for so much of it, you know. But I do think that I'll speak from my personal experience. Competing for so long and at a high level lets me feel what that is like. And that feeling gives me some insight that helps me be a better coach.
Yeah.
And that's a thing that if you've never had that experience, it's going to be really difficult for you to understand what the hell I'm talking about.
Right.
Because I have a hard time even putting a word on it. You know, I can't put a word on it. I don't know what it is. I can't point to a thing and say, see, if I'd never competed, I wouldn't know to do that. You know, it's not that. There's this feeling component that I think subtly affects my decision making. And I can trace it back to just having experiences, you know, and I think that that's helped me be a better coach. Of course, that's not all of coaching, but I think when we bang the drum that, you know, hey, just because you're an athlete, you're not a great coach. Yes, that's true in general, but I don't know, maybe I'm taking it too personally, you know, that, hey, there's some little bit of experience that being a high level athlete allows me to be an even better coach.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And that's, you know, I think you're right. And that's coming from somebody who's never been a high level athlete. And I think the key is just understanding that, like, what people mean to say, I think, when they say being a good coach and being an athlete is not the same thing, is what they mean to say is that the explicit skills are not the same. I agree with that. The vast majority of
For
them
sure,
are.
yes.
But like, experience matters. And it precisely, I think we as coaches have a tendency to shy away from things that we can't explain. We've talked about this before, right? Like how you can't necessarily explain why you chose sets of 6 instead of sets of 5 for an athlete, right? And I think, you know, for a variety of reasons, we as coaches tend to shy away from those things. Mostly, I think, because we are sort of the sort of culture of coaching is to be expected to be the guy who knows it all. And I think that you have to abandon that pretense. You have to make clear to your athletes that you don't know everything. All you're doing is taking some combination of experience and knowledge, you know, to help them get to the next stage of their athletic career. And you know, I have zero experience at a high level of athletics, right? Like the best I've ever done is like when I was still doing Tung Sudo, the martial art that I did for a really long time. I competed in point fighting at like a fairly high level for my age. Like I was good, I was above average, but I wasn't world class. But even so, like just having the understanding of the stress of competition and understanding like how much it means to a person, just having that experience. You know, we talk a lot about trusting the process and buy-in. And if your athlete, it doesn't even have to be explicit. Most of my athletes have never asked me, nor have I ever told them about like, what is my athletic background? What was it like? We never had those discussions. But all the same, I think they get a sense that I understand how stressed out they are. I understand what this means to them. And that creates a greater sense of buy-in, as well as exactly what you're saying. Sometimes you just get a feeling of like, it's not explicit. It's maybe not even explicable. There probably isn't a word for it, but you just sort of know.
Yeah.
Well,
and
I think
I should be fair as well and say that, you know, if I want to give weight to my personal experiences and say that gives me some beneficial insight, that other people from non-athletic backgrounds are going to have a variety of different experiences that are going to do the same thing for them. So, for example, Eric Helms has a PhD. You know, surely something along that line has given him some insight that's just not going to be available to me. Or my friend Matt Gary has worked with football players, has been a football player at a fairly high level, you know, and so maybe you can draw on things from other sports or just other pieces of your background and your experience, like all those things are going to matter.
Yeah,
So, those insights that they have are equally as valid as whatever I've got.
Right. I mean, you've often said, I think, or rather, I don't know if you said it explicitly, but in my sort of read of you, it seems like probably the most influential coach, or at least one of them on your work, is Bondarchuk. Bondarchuk never was a powerlifter.
Right.
As far as I know, right? I mean, for God's sake, man, like some of the most influential stuff for me have, like, as coaches, like, first of all, like people like you and Max, powerlifting, two guys who coach powerlifters and also weightlifters. In Max's case, I coach fitness athletes, right? Steve Magnus was super influential for me. He coaches runners. The only coach I would cite that has had a significant impact on me that seems to make sense really is Alex Viada. That kind of makes sense, right? He doesn't coach CrossFitters, but he coaches people who want to be strong and have good endurance. But, like, if anything, the biggest influence on me, I've said time and again, is learning philosophy.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense, but it's exactly, like, I think the larger point we're driving at here is, like, coaching is some mixture of an explicit set of knowledge and skills combined with some sort of tacit or implicit understanding of things that are outside of that knowledge base. And I think our tendency is to shy away from those things that are outside the really explicit stuff. And I get it, right? Especially in an era when there's so much nonsense. There's a lot of nonsense on the internet. So I understand the tendency to be skeptical of things that seem to be hokey or not have a clear explanation. I completely understand that tendency. I don't even know if I think it's like a bad tendency. It's good to be skeptical. But at the same time, we have to sort of be willing to acknowledge where there are holes in our ability to be, like, just explicit and empirical and super objective. And we have to be willing at times to lean into hunches and a sense of experience. Like, and if you're the kind of person who just isn't going to do that, like, that's okay. You might have good reasons for it, but I do think it's going to limit your ability as a coach in the fullest sense of the word. It's going to limit your ability to have effective interactions with your athletes, which drive them towards their goals.
Yeah. Speaking of the societal tendency to be skeptical of things, I'm not sure if I would characterize it the same way. And certainly societal level problems are outside of my scope. But
based on how things are going, they seem to be outside of everyone's scope.
Yeah, we don't know what's going on anymore. So so where I'm going with this is at least in my little powerlifting subculture, there are some, not all, certainly not all, but there's like a subset that tend to want or need or something, a scientific, sciencey sounding explanation for everything.
Yeah.
And I know this is kind of a thing that you think about a lot in a philosophical sense, just what's available to us, from an empirical standpoint, and then what's available. There's a gap between the knowledge that's available to people from an empirical standpoint, not even just in the sense of, does the science exist or not, but could it even exist if we wanted it to?
It's an empirical question.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the case. Like, I think everyone agrees, or everyone, given the opportunity to discuss it, I think everyone would agree. Not every question is empirical. Yeah. Some questions are non-empirical by nature. Like, do I want pizza or burgers is a fundamentally non-empirical question. There isn't a fact, or rather, like, insofar as there is a fact of the matter, the fact is only, like, I decided I want this one, right? That's just not a really empirical question in the sense it's commonly used. And yeah, there's definitely the tendency that you're describing certainly exists. And again, like, for the most part, it's not a bad thing. You should want reasons to do things.
Yes.
But yeah, there's definitely like, I think we often do ourselves a disservice when we demand that the reasons be either wholly empirical or like, even if they are conceptually empirical, that like sometimes science has to play catch up. Sometimes, the people in the trenches, quote unquote, figure some stuff out first. And I think what it often looks like is they figure it out. A great example probably is like old school bodybuilders. Obviously, they did effective stuff. They did a bunch of ineffective stuff too, I'm sure, but they got big and strong and jacked. They did something effective. And, obviously they're on drugs, but like, you still have to do something effective to get, Arnold Schwarzenegger. You don't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger without doing something right.
Yeah.
I think the way it often looks is that, the people in the gym go through this plethora of ways they train, and they find the ones that for some reason just seem to work the best. And maybe 5 or 10 or 20 years down the line, some research comes out that says, oh, these guys were onto something. But the risk is to brush it off as it's actually happening, and like to wait until it's empirically, scientifically supported, right? Like, and of course, I say it's a risk, but it's not even really a risk because we all know that's not how training actually happens. Like, I cannot think of a successful athlete I've met or worked with whose training was literally just like, I just do a bunch of stuff from PubMed.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
I mean, and I don't mean to, set up a bunch of straw men for us to knock down here. So I'm not sure if I'm doing that or not, but
I don't think so. I mean, I think the thing you're describing certainly happens. Like,
yeah. I think maybe a better way to put it is kind of like, where do you put your weight, when it comes to evidence? And this is probably a question that would be great to talk to somebody who, has a really excellent handle on reading and analyzing research. But let me, Greg would be a great one. Eric would be a great one. Any of those guys. But let me kind of outline an example to illustrate what I'm thinking about here. So the hypertrophy rep range, whatever it's defined as, 8 to 15 reps or something like that. That was the commonly accepted rep range for the longest time. If you're trying to gain size, that's what you need to do. Less than 8, well, that's not hypertrophy. More than 8, now you're in. More than 15, you're doing endurance. Right. So we start to do some research, and we find, hey, actually, you can get hypertrophy at a wide variety of rep ranges. And hypertrophy conceivably just as good. It doesn't seem to be dependent on rep range, really at all. And so everyone's like, the bros are wrong, and yeah, in that sense, right? If you're going to define it that narrowly, yeah, they're wrong. But things move forward a bit more, and you start to paint a picture of, well, if we take into account things like fatigue management, if we take into account things like the intensity that you need to train at, if we take into account injury potential and time management and things like that, it makes sense. Staying in that 8 to 15 zone is probably the best thing to do most of the time.
Yeah, I specifically remember, I'm 99% sure this was actually something Greg wrote, so I hope I'm not misattributing it, but I'm pretty certain it was, where he was talking about this exact thing. Just so anybody knows who, if we're unclear, we're talking about Greg Nuckols, where he wrote this exact thing, where he basically said, look, the research seems to suggest that like doing 10 sets of 3 or 3 sets of 10 doesn't really matter for hypertrophy which one you do. But you know what does matter? If you do 10 sets of 3 and it takes you an hour instead of 3 sets of 10 taking you 20 minutes, that matters. That matters in a non-trivial way. inside a vacuum, I guess it doesn't matter. But training doesn't happen inside a vacuum. Training happens to human beings living in the real world.
Right. Yeah. And so I think the problem that I end up thinking about from time to time is whenever you're taking something out of, whenever you're looking at some research, and it says X intervention is better than Y intervention. Where are you in the arc of scientific exploration? Like, are you at the point where we're just figuring out, it doesn't matter 10 sets of 3 or 3 sets of 10? Like, are you at that point, or are you at the point where you have a greater, there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom.
Yeah.
And I suppose that again, kind of talking about risk management, that leads me to a risk management profile where I tend to, if there's a debate, if it's open to interpretation, then I tend to err toward experiential knowledge, I guess. Yeah, and especially like when you consider the time problem, the fact that we're talking about managing development of athletes over careers instead of 8 weeks at a time or something.
Yeah, the way that I kind of think about that, because that question specifically, like I think about risk taking quite a bit, specifically because I know I'm, like I said, not a risk taker by nature. The way that I try to conceptualize it is I try to figure out where any individual athlete I'm working with falls on like a spectrum of being, relatively like risk, leaning towards being risk taking or leaning towards being kind of playing it safe. And I try to adjust my recommendations for them based on that. So, if I have an athlete who's really prone to risk taking behavior, then I'll tend to lean harder into my own tendency to play it safe. Because specifically with regards to time, it's not about where it lands us on one workout, because I'm assuming that over the course of a year or 5 years, if my athlete is a natural risk taker and I'm naturally somebody who plays it safe, that if I lean into my tendency to counterbalance that, we'll find the middle pretty effectively. Whereas if I have an athlete who's a little less of a risk taker, I have to kind of go outside of my own tendencies and push them to take risks. And the goal is always just to find the center, and it's always going to be a moving target. And a big part of working with an athlete over a long period of time is to kind of try to keep the crosshairs on that moving target over the course of a career.
Would you say that that's maybe a conscious part of your process? I don't know if conscious is necessarily the right word, but is that something that you actively think about? Like, I need to push this person to take more risks, or do you think of it in different terms, or is it something?
I think of it retroactively, but I think the actual process is it just happens in real time, so to speak. I just again, it's down to experience, right? I just have a sense of it. I just have a sense that a certain athlete, based on what they say or what they do, like I just have a sense of the way they interact with risks, and I sort of adjust my behavior accordingly. And certainly,
like social intelligence, right?
Yeah, exactly. Maybe that's a good way to put it. First time anybody's ever suggested I had any kind of social intelligence. No, but it's happening in real time, and I think I'm capable now with where I am as a coach now. I'm capable of looking back and saying, like, I could give you names of a couple athletes who I work with and say, oh, this athlete is more of a risk taker, this athlete plays it safe. But for the most part, I think it just happens in real time, and it's just a sort of subconscious tendency of me to adjust my behavior to the athlete.
Yeah, and that seems to be a standard thing to do in terms of human interaction. So I don't see why.
Give me 2 seconds. I have to step away from the computer for like 30 seconds. So I'm going to give you some nice editing to do later.
No problem.
What time are you off?
I'm not done until 8.
Okay, I should be around.
Okay, bye.
Sorry, Josie's leaving for work. Just stand by. I think you're right. I think it is a primarily a subconscious process. And I think that the ability to think explicitly about that process is useful. I don't know if it's necessary to develop it, right? Like, I don't know if you have to be able to sit down and really think about it. But it's probably helpful to do so. I think almost certainly you can only think about it, like, I'm pretty sure you can only think about it really, like, retroactively. I don't know if it's possible really to, like, because when do you figure it out, right? Let's say you start working with an athlete. It's not, there's no way you already know the answer to that question. Okay, we ran this athlete through an assessment and I'm writing their first block of training. You don't already know if they're a risk taker or not. There's just no way.
Well, even if you're talking about, like, once you've established some of these patterns, you know, I wonder if it's not one of these things where it's like, how do you throw a ball? Well, you just throw it, you know, and if you think too much about it, you're going to mess it up, you know, that it needs to be natural. And I wonder if, you know, if you start thinking too much about it, like, oh man, so-and-so's, you know, pretty conservative, so I need to take some steps to proactively push them forward, you know, that you know, that makes me nervous.
We're also talking about risk taking in this really general sense.
Yeah.
But the truth of the matter is that it's probably more like this athlete needs to be pushed to take certain types of risks, and maybe they need to be pushed to avoid other types of risks. Like, you know, it's obviously there's only so much granularity we can introduce sort of in this format, or maybe in general. Yeah. But the reality is that, like, we are talking about risks in this really general sense, and in actuality, they all have their own sort of contours, and we have to be aware of that as well. And again, perhaps just subconsciously, I don't know, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nuance to this stuff, and a lot of it will be maybe forever subconscious. I don't know.
Well, to kind of throw a hackneyed example on it, you know, you've got an athlete who likes to push things in training. You know, they're very aggressive in training. They're, you know, a so-called risk taker in the vernacular of this conversation. But then, you know, when they're, I don't know, like nutritionally, you know, they play it very safe, you know, and they're unwilling to try to gain any weight or to manipulate their nutrition in some way that could potentially be beneficial. So
yeah, risk taking, like most things, is domain dependent. Like I said, that I'm naturally kind of risk averse, so I would never go skydiving. I'm not jumping out of a plane. Are you insane? Right? But my entire athletic background almost like is combat sports. You know, 5 or 6 times a week I get on a mat and I try to choke people out. They try to choke me out. I used to compete in point fighting. I competed in knockdown karate. So, like, I'll take the risk of getting into a, you know, combat sports arena with another human and putting my body on the line in a very real way. So it's just like there is nuance, there is granularity here. Risk taking is not, I think, is usually not can't be ascribed generally. Like, people are willing to take certain risks or certain maybe types of risks, and just unwilling to take other types of risks. And kind of, you know, I don't know to what extent you want to get into that when you're thinking about coaching athletes. But I think at least having a peripheral awareness of it is, like, useful to your interactions with the athlete, because a lot of what we're getting at just comes down to that, right? Like one might ask very reasonably, well, what am I supposed to do with all this? You're not supposed to do anything with it. You're supposed to continue interacting with your athletes in the way that you think is the most beneficial to them. But having some knowledge and understanding, just having, like, in the back of your mind thinking about these problems is going to change the way you interact with your athletes over time. And I think that's the, you know, especially with this kind of stuff, that's the best you can hope for. And that's enough. That's enough. Like, I interact with my athletes differently than I did 5 years ago. Not because or maybe partially because I know more and because I've learned more, but also just because I think about this stuff, and it's led me to think about some things differently than I used to. And as a result, not only the things I tell my athletes, but the way that I talk to my athletes, the way that I answer their questions has changed. So, it's probably enough to just be thinking in some meaningful sense about these problems. And over time, that's going to impact the way that you actually do your job.
Yeah. I think that's an important takeaway, that not every lesson is learned immediately, that there's like this slow burn that happens, as I was talking with someone about that today. They brought up a few coaches in my field, some younger guys who tend to speak in a lot of absolute terms, and that annoyed this person.
When we were younger, though.
What's that?
Didn't we? I mean, I know when I was 20, I thought I didn't merely speak in absolutes. I thought in absolutes.
That was my point. I was like, I mean, I'm guilty of the same things. Like I've got articles out there where I, said that this is true or that's true or here's the way that it works, and it's
your old stuff, and you're just like, God, idiot.
Like, I mean, that's I guess in a grand sense, that's a good thing, right? Like that's a marker of
it's good to be able to look back, and it's good to be okay with having been wrong.
Yeah, and just to be able to say like, hey, I've grown and improved in these last several years instead of just kind of sat still and didn't do anything. Right. So I don't know. I mean, it's probably to some extent one of these things that just happens, as you go, as you develop,
Yeah, I mean, it's if you do anything for long enough, one would hope that your views and skills would evolve. Yeah. I'm sure there are people who that doesn't happen for, but like, I don't want to hang out with those people. They sound boring. Yeah, I mean, and I think it's worth noting, and this is something else I'm pretty sure we've actually talked about when podcasting, is that I think the concepts of right and wrong are just of really limited utility. They're just not useful concepts. Like, first of all, I don't even know what it means to say, like, let's say we're having a discussion about squat technique. And I say, Mike, it's right to squat with your toes in a straight line. I don't even know what I would mean by that. Like, what is that? It's right? In what sense? Is it objectively correct? Measured against what? Like, I don't even understand. But I think the thing is, when you're young, both in terms of age and in terms of like, when I was 20 years old, I was a smart person. I wasn't dumb, but I had been coaching professionally for a couple of years, and it's just everything is so much easier when it's black and white. Like I wish that it was black and white, right or wrong. I mean, I guess I don't, because we'd probably be out of a job, right? Like this would be very easy. But the truth of the matter is that, like, I think that right and wrong, correct and incorrect, true and untrue, with regards to coaching, like, I think, and the writing of programs, they're just really not only limited in utility, they might be actively detrimental. And I would encourage, like, young coaches, people who are getting into this profession, and I'm here I'm using the term young, not only in terms of age necessarily, but just in terms of like how much time how long you've been doing this. I would encourage those people to, as quickly as they can, develop a more nuanced understanding of like what it means to be right or wrong in the context of coaching and programming. And I want to be clear here. I say as quickly as they can, probably not very quickly. It takes time. There's no avoiding the fact that it takes time to do it. But I think that if you do it, it's for the best.
This calls to mind one of those. It's a meme that you see bouncing around now and then about.
You know that about me.
A person's actual knowledge versus their perceived knowledge. So in the beginning you don't know anything. You know that you don't know anything. Then you learn a little bit. And you think that you've learned it all, and then
a name for the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yeah.
I think that it's easy to look at that and say, you always point to someone else and say they're doing it, not me, so again, like to turn the lens back to myself, like I wonder, and I think this about lots of things, right? Like, what am I going to look back on in 5, 10, 20 years and think, man, that was a boneheaded move, like
one thing is going to be your association with me.
Well, for sure that one. But well, I always think about my grandpa when I think about this. And I remember when I was a little kid, my grandpa. I mean, grandpas are old when you first meet them. A lot of times, right?
Usually,
usually that's the case. But anyway, so he's an old guy. He'd smoked all his life. He had emphysema and heart trouble and lots of things, and I remember, I mean, I'm just a little kid, right? But I knew that cigarettes were bad.
At a different point in time.
Yeah. So I remember asking him, like, Grandpa, why did you even start smoking cigarettes? And he says, like, well, you got to understand, when I started smoking, we didn't know that cigarettes were bad for you. And that was like this huge epiphany for me. I was like, holy crap, like, what else do we just not know is bad for you, or not know is good for you, or like this like event horizon for knowledge, it becomes a lot more tangible when you think about it that way.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and it's exactly that. We're like, to us, when we say we know smoking is bad, we don't mean, like, I couldn't explain to you the mechanistic reasons that smoking is bad for you. We just have this correct sort of we have a cultural intuition that smoking is bad that happens to be correct. It happens to be the case that smoking is bad. But I personally, I couldn't tell you, I don't know how it works. Like, but I just have this, I look at somebody smoking a cigarette and I'm like, putting smoke inside you seems bad. I don't actually know why.
And that's learned, right? That you've learned that because of the societal messages that get sent to you, right?
And in this case, those societal messages, as it turns out, happen to be correct. But it's worth noting that, like, I merely happen to be correct. There are other societal messages that I've probably, like, absorbed that it's going to turn out 10 years from now we're wrong about. But yeah, I mean, that's a great point. It's exactly it. Like, it wasn't that your grandpa was unintelligent or uninformed. It was merely that, like, he didn't have access to this knowledge that we do. And at a certain point, if there's enough of it and it's widespread enough and loudly, it's messaged loud and clear, you get to the point where we are now, where it's just sort of accepted. Like, everybody knows smoke. People who smoke know smoking's bad.
Right.
They don't know. And yeah, it is an interesting case where, like, what are we doing right now? I mean, we can even probably think of, like, it's only relatively recently that we figured out, like, how, potentially dangerous burning fossil fuels can be, right? Like, I don't want to upset anybody who whatever, like, thinks that's not the case. But, like, look, regardless of where you might fall on, like, the causes of climate change or whatever, I think we can all acknowledge, like, oh, there are risks associated with this, whether they're risks to the environment or risks to personal health or whatever. And it's only in the last, I don't know, 2 decades that we've, like, really started to understand what those risks are and what they look like and all that, to the point where, if, I was born in 1988, and it's likely that people who are my age now, 30, in 1988, would never have internalized an understanding of those risks in the same way that I have. I've internalized an understanding of those risks because they are they have become common knowledge. And again, like, it's not about, I'm not, last thing I want to do is, like, talk about climate change or anything like that. Like, that's not my point. My point is, because there's this sort of widespread understanding that, like, risks exist that are associated with this, I can intuit that, in the sense that I can look at a old truck spitting out fumes, and I just somehow know, like, there's something not good about it. And it just so happens that intuition is correct. But certainly, I have some intuitions that feel correct, and it'll turn out or not.
Yeah.
It's funny that like it's hard for us to conceptualize that about things that other people thought 100 years ago or 50 years ago or whatever. It's very, very hard to cope with that. It's weird.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a very deep rabbit hole.
Believe me, I've noticed.
Yeah, I'm sure you have. It calls to mind maybe a less well-known example, I guess. There was the central governor theory of fatigue. That was a theory that was catching on for a while. It seems to have lost a lot of steam lately, or lost a lot of support lately, maybe is a better way to put it. Sure. Anyway, so it was a theory that fatigue in a physical sense doesn't happen in the peripheral tissues. So say you're doing a bench press, maybe a better example is running a race, that sure. you start to slow down, you can't run any faster, you get tired and you start to slow down. That it's not necessarily that your legs are tired or that there's no oxygen to feed the muscles. It's not necessarily that, but your brain is really kind of pulling the throttle back in order to preserve the self in some way, and
right. Protected.
Yeah. So at one time we thought fatigue happens in the tissues. There's no oxygen for the muscles, or there's no whatever substrate for the muscles to use. And then there's this competing theory. And it seemed like for a while, the two sides were more or less entrenched. And you had the older crowd that believed in the peripheral theories of fatigue, and you had younger scientists who believed in this central governor theory. It was kind of this situation where you were waiting for the older guys to all retire before this new theory kind of took over, right? But then it seems like, predictions being fallible as they are, the worm has turned a bit, and I'm far from being an expert in this field, so I'm sure that there are reasons why it's lost support. I don't know what those reasons are, but it seems like the acceptance of this theory, or at least the use of it, has kind of stalled a bit.
Yeah, it's waned. Yeah, what I'd like to do here is I'd like to recommend a book about this. It's called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, and it's about this very thing. Have you ever heard of it, Mike?
I think I heard about it at some point.
For those listeners who might be unaware, it is a topic, an ongoing topic of contention, that Mike refuses to finish this damn book. And every time we talk, you bring up like ideas and concepts that are literally what this book is about. And you just
I can't do it, man. I tried.
Come on, man. You went to college. How many books did you read in college that you absolutely didn't want to read?
You would be shocked at the number.
Actually, no, I wouldn't. I know how that works. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's all right. And like, there are really interesting. It's interesting because you say you don't know the reasons. There are reasons, and what's interesting is that some of the reasons might be what we would generally consider like scientific reasons. That is to say, oh, there's research coming out that is pushing away from this theory or whatever. But some of the reasons are probably non-scientific. Some of the reasons may be cultural. They may be, they might have to do with like. Essentially, there is a paradigm in place. Let's say it's the peripheral fatigue paradigm, just to give it a name. And that's been the dominant paradigm for some fairly long period of time. And it's hard to shake that. So maybe in 10 more years, we'll break through and we'll have a new paradigm. And maybe it will be the central governor paradigm. Maybe it'll be something else. Maybe it'll just be like the sort of importing of the central governor theory into a more robust version of the paradigm we have now. But yeah, it's interesting because the changes that you're talking about, there's a lot of things that have to happen for them to occur, and not all of those things are driven by research per se. There are cultural reasons and stuff like that for things to shift over, and yeah, it'll be interesting to see because like the paradigm we have now, it's not quote unquote correct, or actually a better way to put that is it's not quote unquote true. It's merely the theory that seems to be the most in line with all the information we have at the moment. At some point, it's bound to change. It's bound to become more nuanced. We're bound to understand it better. I don't know what direction it'll go in. Maybe it'll turn out the central governor theory is correct. Maybe some entirely new theory emerges, but that's how science works. The theory we have now, the dominant theory, is just the one that's the most commensurate with the information available. It doesn't mean it's quote unquote true. It's just the best we've got for now.
Let me ask you a question that's probably answered in this book.
Look right now. It's about 2-3 feet away from me. I can see it.
I know.
I'm just going to grab it off my windowsill and start flipping through the page. Let's check this index.
Are there examples? So, all right. So I'm thinking if paradigms shift over time, it's humans doing the shifting. Humans can be wrong. Has there been a time where we've more or less abandoned one paradigm for a new one, only to find I mean, of course you think it's better, otherwise you wouldn't adopt a new paradigm, only to find out later, oh wait, that was actually worse. Let's go back to the old one.
Not that I'm aware of. I think the thing is that paradigm shifts happen really gradually, and essentially what has to happen is there have to be enough anomalies within the current paradigm that at some point you have to stop ignoring them and make a shift, right? So the shift isn't really explicit. The shift is like, so I think the best example Kuhn uses in the book, and I'm gonna get the details wrong to some extent, but he talks about oxygen. Oxygen was quote unquote discovered maybe like 4 times prior to it being officially, air quotes again, discovered. And what happened was all these different scientists had discovered oxygen. They had stumbled upon it, but they assumed it was anomalous because it didn't fit with the paradigm. It didn't fit with what they already knew. And then eventually it happened enough times or under some certain set of circumstances in which it came to light that like, oh, no, this is real and this is what it is. And that's when we came to acknowledge it as oxygen. I think that what tends to happen is not like a paradigm we don't like look back and say, oh, it's worse than the one we had before, but rather just the process happens again. We go through it again and we sort of use up the paradigm. We answer all the questions that we can answer within that paradigm, and anomalies start to pile up again, and away we go on to the next one. So I think that the problem is the problem is thinking that paradigms are supposed to be true or untrue. They aren't true or untrue. What they do is they draw a set of parameters around this certain question or set of questions, right? You can think of a particular field of scientific inquiry as like a set of questions. And eventually you get as close to answering all those questions as you realistically can within the paradigm, and you have to make a change. So paradigms like, I mean, probably actually like the oxygen one, I think, illustrates this the best, but the most well-known paradigm shift is going from Newtonian mechanics to relativistic mechanics, right? Like, but of course, Newtonian mechanics weren't like wrong per se. We still use those models for certain things.
You're still teaching, yeah.
Right, and at a certain point, they lost their explanatory power to answer new questions. We answered all the questions that we could really answer with Newtonian mechanics, and we had to create a new paradigm in order to continue answering questions. So I think it's more like that. Like, I don't think paradigms aren't right or wrong or true or untrue. They're useful, and we use them as well as we can. And at some point, the paradigm has to shift in order to continue answering questions. That's what the scientific process is. It's continuously asking more questions and more nuanced questions, more specific questions, and at some point the anomalies pile up and the paradigm you have stops making sense. You have to do something else.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think to some extent, like, there is kind of what you were describing with the central governor theory. There is just a sort of changing of the guard. Like, that's what happens when people get older. They get worse at changing their minds. It's certainly going to happen to us. It happens to everybody. Like, it's just what we do. I think there is some aspect of, like, as younger people come in, they're just more willing to engage with new ideas that are unfamiliar to them. And that's certainly part of it. Like, that's what happened with oxygen. Like, all these guys were unwilling to entertain the possibility that the paradigm was wrong, and then somebody else came along who was willing to entertain it, and now we know what oxygen is. But yeah, and there's just so many factors that go into these things, and some of them are just non-scientific factors.
Right. Yeah. Man, I can think of several other things that we can talk about, but given how long we've been talking at this point, I'm reluctant to go around again. So I think we'll just say that'll be enough. Hopefully
maybe by the next time we do this, you'll have finished structure.
I don't think that will happen. I should,
it would certainly be anomalous.
Aha! I see what you did there. Man, thanks so much. I really enjoy having you on and having these types of conversations. Not a whole lot of people who are interested in having this type of conversation. So I'm definitely enjoy it.
Yeah, it's always a blast for me too, man. I love doing this.
All right. Thanks everybody for watching. See you guys next time.
Reactive training systems.